Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really delighted to hear from all of you. Okay, so before we dive in, I want to situate us a little bit. So we're talking about the Rachlin Murphy Museum of Art at the University of Notre Dame. Our museum is on a Catholic campus, but our collection is wide-ranging and encompasses many different religions, spiritualities, regions, and peoples. Our museum is accessible on the edge of campus, always free, always open to all from campus and community, so we serve both equally. The university has had a collection since 1875, which has expanded and grown into its current home at the Rachlin Murphy Museum of Art, which opened in December of 2023. Today, I want to interrogate one specific aspect of the relatively new museum, the chapel. Correct me if I'm wrong, and this is the room to do that. But I know really of no other art museum that has a space that takes on the dual nature of gallery space and sacred space, couched all within an art museum. So here's what we're looking at. Over the past year that the museum has been open, I've had the privilege of engaging with the chapel in a concentrated way and reflecting on the curious identity of the chapel as both a public sacred space and a public gallery space. The chapel both houses works from the collection and is a work of art in and of itself, as it includes site-specific installations of stained glass, mosaic ceiling, and incised fresco on the walls. The chapel can be said to be contemporary both because of the contemporary works of art that are in the chapel and ontologically. That is, the mere fact that something like this exists, a sacred space inside of an art museum, is contemporary. My goal today is not to unpack the individual works of art, individual contemporary works of art that are inside the chapel, though there's certainly a lot to say about them. That's maybe for another day, but rather to consider the chapel ensconced within an art museum in its fullness as a contemporary space that is a logical extension of our pedagogy, largely based on slow-looking, sustained engagement with works of art and collaborative meaning-making through group discussion, and a transformational grounding for that pedagogy. I'll first talk a bit about the interplay between the chapel and our pedagogy of teaching as spiritually enriching, and then ultimately make an argument for the theological significance of the chapel. So when members of the community or students come into the art museum, I typically propose just looking at one or two works of art. And people are often taken aback by that, because when you have a few hours to go to a museum, time and resources usually dictate that you see as much of the museum as you can, which is okay. I don't come to condemn tourism, especially not in New York City. But at the Rachlin Murphy, we have the wonderful gift of being free and accessible to the community, and this privilege allows us to propose a slower, contemplative way of being in the museum. Though this pedagogical approach, sometimes called slow looking, is used across museum teaching, my own justification for it comes largely from Simone Weil. I owe a lot to Simone Weil, in her essay on the right use of school studies with a view to the love of God. This piece is largely about how school studies, and more specifically the attention that one devotes to school studies, so poring over a geometry proof or painfully coaxing a thesis sentence out of the ether, is the basis for prayer. In her biting line at the outset of the essay, she says that no matter how much one might long to pray well, quote, the quality of attention counts for much in the quality of prayer. Warmth of heart cannot make up for it. Sort of her biting line. So here, Weil argues that prayer, relationship with God, requires a kind of practiced discipline that cannot be substituted by good intended pious stirrings of the heart. In other words, your prayer is only as fruitful to the degree that the soul can empty itself of its own contents in order to receive itself into the being, the thing that it is looking at, just as they are in all of their truth, to paraphrase Weil. I see this contemplative way of approaching art as an exercise in that foundational attention, which in time deepens one's gaze to see the rest of the world with a penetrating eye towards the eternal and miraculous substrate of things, whether for you that is God, the divine, or the generally spiritual. So how does this relate to the chapel? Well, it's part of my logic for its reason for being. In the first year that the museum was open, I like to ask my students why they might justify having a chapel in an art museum, especially considering that a necessary element of an art museum is art, but not a chapel. And there's really nothing like this. And so through conversation, we tend to land on two distinct justifications. One is that a great many art museums, including our own art museum, house sacred objects, Christian and non-Christian alike. Those sacred objects have been largely removed from their sacred context, and the chapel is a reminder that these objects contain meaning beyond their physical form. For example, the Agungun costume in the African Art Gallery is not simply a visually pleasing display of fabrics, though it is that too, but a ritual vestment that points to sacred encounter with ancestors for the Yoruba people of Nigeria. The chapel also has, I took this picture, the chapel also has two niches in the back that host historical sacred objects. At the present moment, a 19th century and a 20th century chalice that hopefully make the connection between object and sacred rite palpable. Another facet of this approach is consideration of art objects that did not play a part in the enacting of ceremony or liturgy, but were nevertheless created for sacred spaces. Here I'm thinking of works of art that were commissioned for altarpieces, sacristies, private devotional objects, etc. What you lose in a museum space is that overtly sacred context, something that says, this is definitely sacred because I'm in a church. The chapel helps to remind us that the context in which you find an object plays a role in your encounter with that object. The second tier of meaning that we ascribe to the existence of the chapel is the disposition that it invites. Here again, we recall Simone Weil. The implication of the sacred invites people to move about the space in a slow and quiet way. Whether or not people are Christian, the idea of a holy space alters the way that people approach that space. The very simple fact that the space has chairs with kneelers invites visitors to sit and stay a while and to admire the art that adorns that space. The disposition of reverence spills out into the rest of the museum. It grants visitors the permission to move slowly. It sparks a contemplative constitution of the mind. And you might know from experience, once you've entered into that sort of contemplative state, the busy world becomes quite jarring. It's like when you step out into the sun after spending 2 hours in a really dark movie theater. It's difficult to return to the humdrum of daily life, and it's much easier actually for people to move about the museum in a way that invites contemplation once they've visited the chapel, Christian or not. This way of being in the museum is ultimately what our teaching in the museum is geared towards, sustained and transformative engagement with works of art. The chapel both fuels that engagement and is a continual font for inspiration to continue the work that we do in this particular way that we do it. Okay, so we've talked about the chapel as a generally fruitful center that promotes and sustains spiritual but not necessarily religious engagement with the collection. But here I want to push us a little farther into a theological justification. I see the chapel in much the same way that a good work of literature gives you a foretaste of eternal life and pushes you back out into the world with a renewed sense of that vision. A good story, as good art does, reminds us of what is to come and places us safely back on the path of our earthly journey, to which we must inevitably return. Judith Wolfe, our colleague at St. Andrews, gives us the example of Tolkien's subtitle of The Hobbit there and back again, and she notes, the back again is the very difficult part. Wolfe gives another example in the Mass. The Mass, which takes place in sacred spaces like the chapel, is an enactment of the heavenly feast. It is that foretaste of eternal life. But Mass, the name we ascribe to the entire service, comes from the word, from the phrase ita missa est, or go, the Mass is ended. So it means missa comes from the Latin being sent or going out. So written in the very structure of the service is that knowledge that we must go out into the world. As Wolfe also mentions, a key moment of eschatological art or imagination, as I have described it, I being Wolfe, therefore, is the need to return to ordinary life in the light of an apocalyptic or epiphanic experience, a return from the Mount of Transfiguration or the Garden of Jesus' tomb. Our chapel in the museum, as all Christian spaces strive to do, provides that glimpse of the consummation of our earthly journeying through the world. It is a reminder of the end of the pilgrimage, but does not pretend to be that end. Insofar as our chapel is part of an art museum, it pushes you out into the rest of the galleries with a renewed sense of the vision, reminding you that in all of creation, we have a foretaste of what is to come. The chapel gives you the chapel gives you a glimpse of the end of the pilgrimage, but reinforces the drama of earthly pilgrimage that God walks with us on, as Walter Brueggemann reminds us. Yahweh is understood not as a God who settles and dwells, but as a God who sojourns and moves about with his people. Here he's taking from 2 Samuel chapter 7. Another literary example that draws us towards the anagogical sense of engagement with a work of art, literary, visual, musical, or otherwise, is in C.S. Lewis's Voyage of the Dawn Treader. When the children learn they are too old to return to Narnia, Aslan tells the children that this was the reason they were brought to Narnia in the first place, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there, that is, in their world. If you will allow me this metaphor, the chapel is like our own personal Narnia. It is the wardrobe inside Professor Diggory Kirk's countryside home. The home, that is the museum in this case, is already a trove of new and thrilling discoveries. But once you step into the glass doors of the chapel, once you enter the wardrobe, so to speak, we are allowed to see God as the sustaining source of all that wonder. But we realize that we must leave. Your class with me in the chapel has ended. The prayer has concluded. The museum will close. The mass has ended. Ite missa est. The journey to the chapel takes you there and back again, softly, lightly. The chapel is a space enveloped by a building dedicated to displaying earthly treasures, the work of human hands. This means that once you leave the chapel, you're not thrust back out into daily life. Once you leave the chapel, you encounter work outside of its sacred context, if only to remind us that we see differently now, with a gaze towards the eternal. The rest of the galleries then become a wayfaring space, a halfway, an incubator space between the glimpse of eternity and the journey back to daily life outside of the walls of the museum. By way of conclusion, I'd like to note that there is no real imperative contained in these words, unless the imperative is to visit the Rachlin Murphy Museum of Art and see if what I say holds up from your own encounters of moving through the space. Beyond the question of why there is a chapel, I think the far more interesting question is what the implications of the chapel and the art museum are. I hope I've laid out the spiritual implications for visitors in this particular museum, but I wonder what the repercussions are, if any, for other artistic spaces and for scholarly discussion regarding the still strange place of religion in contemporary art. I think here we're pretty familiar with James Elkin's 2004 text, The Strange Place of Religion in Contemporary Art. At the outset of this text, Elkins adopts the institutional definition of art as whatever is exhibited in galleries in major cities, bought by museums of contemporary art, shown in biennials and the Documenta, and written about in major periodicals. He mentions that he uses the institutional definition to avoid having to say what art should be about, but notes that even the institutional definition does inadvertently say something about the content of what real art is or should be, by omission. That omission is the overtly religious spaces of worship that also commission and house art. What is curious about the Mary Queen of Families Chapel is that it makes a place for itself within that institutional definition by being itself a work of art that a museum, the Rachlin Murphy Museum of Art, deemed worthy of displaying, so to speak. Elkins, at the outset, also notes, and here I'm paraphrasing, that the problem with earnestly considering religious art in the modern age is that, quote unquote, serious art has undeniably become estranged from religion, so that, religious artists aside, some critics believe that to suddenly put modern art back with religion or spirituality is to give up the history and purposes of a certain understanding of modernism, which is and continues to be a separation that is fundamental for many art historians. And he said this in 2004, and I think it's something with which we are still grappling. In the case of the chapel, though, we're not just talking about individual works of contemporary art and haphazardly suturing them together with religion to create something that might be written off by certain schools as campy in the Sontag version of campy, not the Met Gala version of campy, or contemporary kitsch. So think of art sold in, religious novelty gift shops. But here we're rehearsing belief from within, rehearsing spiritually and physically the work of art itself. Beyond what I hope is a generally spiritually enriching journey for visitors through the museum and back out again, I hope that the chapel might open up for us new ways of thinking about religion and the visual arts that don't presume that religion is the interloper in the project of modernity, but flows out naturally from the contemporary moment where we may still know God through the world precisely because we still live in a world wherein the Word became flesh. In the chapel, we see an old religion expressed physically, created with a collective memory of spiritual insights in mind, of thousands of mystical moments, but that is necessarily contemporary, not just because it's new, but because a chapel, in some sense, must always be contemporary, because God is always revealing God's self anew in each moment to those who enter the space, so that people who wander in might become aware of the ways in which they walk in darkness, and through God manifesting God's self in creation, are able to see a great light. Thank you.